While she's waiting, I'm so sorry you're having to stand up back there. We're used to it, huh?
Okay, we are now live on the web, so I will start the formal introduction. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Urban Studies and Planning and director of the Center for Transportation Studies, which hosts this weekly seminar. I organize it along with my colleagues Chris Monsieur, John Glebe, and Rob Bertini, and now our new colleague Miguel Figliosi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So welcome. And I also want to make sure that I give credit today in particular to OTREC, the Oregon Transportation Research and Education Consortium, which has sponsored the visit today of our speaker as part of their Visiting Scholar series. So thank them for supporting this effort. I am going to now introduce our speaker of the day, who has commonly introduced himself to me and others as Car Free John, though I'll do a more formal introduction of Professor John Pucher. He's a professor at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. Since earning his PhD at MIT back in 1978, he's conducted research on a wide range of topics in transport economics and finance, including numerous projects for the U.S. Department of Transportation, Canadian government, and various European ministries of transport. For over 3 decades, he has examined differences in travel behavior, transport systems, and transport policies in Europe, Canada, and the USA. And currently, his research focuses on walking and bicycling, and in particular, how American cities can learn from European policies to improve the safety, convenience, and feasibility of non-motorized in the U.S. And before I turn it over to him, we'll announce that we've opened up another room.
205 right next door.
205 right next door if anyone wants to watch from there. And then you could walk in at the end to ask your questions in person. It's up to you. You have the choice now. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John. And I am going to ask, particularly given I know what he has to present, I'm going to ask that people hold questions until the end.
Because I go on forever. You can forget all those various credentials, by the way. The really important thing is I'm car-free. So I really do walk and bike around everywhere, so that's the really important thing to note. And I wish I'd been plane-free, I must tell you, because I didn't get into Portland until 4 o'clock this morning. Not only was it a 7-hour plane flight because we had to take a huge detour, but we spent 5.5 hours on the runway before we even took off. So I've had about 3 hours of sleep, folks. So whatever energy level I have, it's a lot lower than it normally is, and I apologize if I'm not quite as full of energy as I normally am. In New Jersey, people would call that flight the flight from hell. But I can tell you, at least it was not a flight to hell, because so far I've been really enjoying the few hours I've been able to spend here in Portland. And I find people actually smile at you here in Portland. I got a cup of coffee across the way here in whatever that place is called, and they actually smile and say, "Good morning, have a good day." And in New Jersey, they sort of grunt at you. I mean, be grateful you're in Portland. It's a really, really nice place, and the sun really does shine. It doesn't rain all the time. Well, to the topic of the day, I wish I'd been walking and cycling here instead of taking the plane, that's for sure. I think walking and cycling are really, really essential ways of getting around our cities, not just from the point of view of transportation, but I think that walking and cycling make our cities more livable, more interesting, more sustainable. And I really do walk and cycle almost everywhere I go, combined with public transportation. Most of you in this room have heard certainly about the term sustainability. And there's 3 different aspects, or it depends on how you want to define it, 3 different criteria, dimensions of sustainability: environmental, social, and economic sustainability. And I would argue that walking and cycling on every single one of those 3 dimensions are the most sustainable modes of transportation, certainly the most sustainable ways of getting around our cities. And again, not just from the point of view of getting from point A to point B, but they actually contribute something to the livability, the sustainability of our cities. They're certainly the most environmentally friendly modes of transportation. I mean, virtually no pollution at all, whether it's in terms of air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution. Virtually no or very, very little in the way of non-renewable resources used for building bikes or making shoes. In terms of social sustainability, certainly very equitable on that point of view. Almost everyone, I mean literally everyone, can afford to walk and to cycle. You can buy a bike for almost nothing, or they have bike libraries, at least in New Jersey, where you can get one for free. So it's certainly affordable by every segment of the population, and I would argue it's also physically possible, both walking and cycling, for most people. There's going to be some small percentage, without any question, with certain disabilities that prevent them from walking or cycling, but I would argue that probably at least 90%, 95% of the population is physically able to walk and to cycle. Economical, they certainly don't take much. I've been calculating, actually. I've saved something like, I was just in Ireland about a week ago, and there was a big sustainability conference in Dublin, and we were sort of discussing just over dinner how much we'd saved by not owning a car, and it was something like $400,000 or $500,000 over a lifetime, maybe even more than that. So anyway, it's certainly cheap in terms of a private expenses that you have to have in terms of walking or cycling. In New Jersey, insurance costs alone for a car is something like $2,000 a year, but also in terms of public costs. What it costs to provide the infrastructure that's necessary for walking and cycling is a tiny fraction of what you have to pay in terms of providing highway facilities, gigantic parking facilities. So from a public point of view, also, it's economically much, much more sustainable. In fact, I have a German, I always go on tangents, that's why I warn you this. I have a German doctoral student, Ralph, and he was telling me that Berlin, the city of Berlin, is basically bankrupt. And so they decided, precisely for this reason, they're going to focus all their transportation expenditures on walking and cycling because it's much cheaper than any other possibility. So from a public point of view and a private point of view, it certainly is the most economically sustainable mode. Some of you might say, well, yeah, you're going to save money, but you're going to waste time. Wrong. There was a study by the British Medical Association showing that for every hour you walk or cycle, you add more than an hour to your expected healthy lifetime. That's your lifetime without a major disability. Again, don't ever let anyone tell you you're wasting your time when you're walking or cycling, because every hour you spend walking or cycling, you are adding more than an hour to your expected healthy lifetime. In short, I think these are great modes of transportation. And in spite of all these wonderful benefits, though, what you find in most states and in most cities here in the United States, and in most countries as well, I mean, there are certainly big exceptions, such as the Netherlands, Denmark, many cities in Germany, but I would say certainly in most American states and in most American cities that these very sustainable modes get the least funding of any transportation modes, they get the least roadway space, the least priority in roadway use, the least in the way of education and training efforts, and by far they are not respected by the police or the courts, at least they're not in New Jersey, and I would say in general in almost every American state that they receive inadequate rights vis-a-vis motorists. And I think that one of the big issues that's come up over the past 5, 6, 7 years is the tremendous importance of walking and cycling from the point of view of public health. Because walking and cycling provide you tremendously valuable forms of cardiovascular exercise on a regular daily basis. You don't have to go to the gym. You don't have to buy expensive exercise equipment, go to your basement and try to have the self-discipline to do this. I hate gyms. I hate them. As far as I'm concerned, they're torture chambers. And so my entire life I've hated gyms. They're smelly, they're disgusting, you can't see outside and so forth. Anyway, I love walking and cycling, so I'm getting my daily physical activity simply in the process of living, in the process of getting from point A to point B. I don't have to plan this. I don't have to discipline myself to get that physical activity. I'm getting that physical activity simply in the normal process of living and getting around the town. And I think it's much more dependable. One of the problems, as you'll see in just a second, is that Americans and many people in OECD countries, both in Western Europe, Canada, Australia, aren't getting enough physical activity. Well, this is an ideal form of physical activity. It doesn't cost anything, it's dependable, and you can integrate it right into your daily lifestyle. In addition to which, that physical activity that you're getting from walking and cycling, it's not just for burning up calories, so you can eat that extra muffin or whatever you want to eat, ice cream and so forth. It's also because physical activity in itself, totally aside from burning up calories, is really, really important in terms of being healthy. And just look at that. That's why I sort of had it big and bold. Whether you are normal weight, overweight, or obese, physically inactive persons are 2 to 3 times more likely to die prematurely. So there's 2 really big reasons why you want to get out there and walk and cycle and get that physical activity, not just to prevent from being obese, but just that physical activity in itself is extremely valuable. And it doesn't take a lot. You don't have to run the marathon to get these benefits. Even 20 or 30 minutes of moderate physical activity every day is a huge benefit in terms of your health. You can see this. I'm not going to try to explain the exact graph, but that's the point. Even 20 or 30 minutes a day of walking and cycling, and that's all you need to get to places you want to get to, that's going to tremendously improve your own health. And it turns out that the lack of that physical activity is the second leading cause of disease in OECD countries. Unfortunately, the United States doesn't do very well. Well, we're the champion, I suppose, if you want to look at it that way. We're certainly the most obese country of any major advanced industrialized country. And you can see, and that's just getting higher and higher, higher. Every year the rate of obesity increases. We now have about 1/3 of all American adults obese. And this is not just fat. It's greatly overweight. It's where your body mass index, so this is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. But it's a specific index, but it means very overweight. And we have 1/3 of all Americans who are obese and 2/3 who are technically overweight. The UK is the next. It's something like, I think it's 23%. Australia is like 21%. Turns out Canada is 15%, and we did Ireland as well. But anyway, you can see we're certainly more obese than most other advanced industrialized countries. It is sort of weird that all of the most obese countries speak English. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not sure if there's a relationship there. But it is weird that all the countries that speak English are the most obese. I don't know. It must make some relation to the English diet or something. I don't know. But anyway, it certainly is alarming. And in the United States, every single region of the United States has gotten more and more obese over this 15-year period. You're not doing too badly here in Oregon. Certainly you're not doing as bad as in the southeast. But anyway, every state in the United States has experienced over this 15-year period a big rise in obesity. And now look at this map really carefully. If you see the red, dark orange sort of area there in the southeast, it just so happens, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that particular region of the country has the absolute lowest levels of walking, cycling, and transit use, and the very highest levels of car dependence. I'll let you draw the conclusion. As bad as the problem is among adults in the United States, it's I think, an even more troubling development that childhood obesity has been skyrocketing in the United States. A quadrupling, folks, a quadrupling in childhood obesity. And there have been a lot of studies showing that if you get really obese as a child, it makes it really, really difficult as an adult not to be obese as well. So this is something of really major concern. In fact, we're just starting a project with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation looking specifically at this tremendous problem of childhood obesity. It really is an epidemic. Here's the relationship here. If you sort of graph out this relationship between levels of obesity among these various countries, and then you look at that's the red line, and then sort of what's the percentage of walk, cycle, and public transit in these various countries, you'll see there's a very strong, I can't say it proves anything, but it certainly suggests that there's a very strong negative correlation between obesity and then on one hand, and walking, cycling, and transit on the other hand. There's this one little, if you look at the United Kingdom, for whatever, this is a sort of bump there. I was giving this talk actually exactly a week ago in Dublin, and David Bannister, a good friend and colleague, says, this is the British bump right here. But anyway, but it clearly suggests that those countries which have a tremendous higher levels of walking, cycling, and public transit use are much more successful in terms of giving their populations regular daily levels of physical activity and therefore avoiding obesity. And by the way, this is a theme which is going to come up later today, not too much later, but anyway, that I really see these three modes, walking, cycling, and public transportation, as a package of integrated alternatives to the car. That you can't really look at walking separately from cycling, from public transportation. All three of these environmental modes, or green modes, that's why I have it actually in green, they really have to work together in partnership with each other. Just to show you again, I suppose, how different these levels of walking and cycling are among the various countries. It's really stunning. We have less than 10%. Of course, it varies from one state to another, from one city to another. But for the United States as a whole, less than 10% of all of our trips within urban areas are by walking or cycling. And if you go to the other end, you have the Netherlands, where you have 46%. But you don't even have to go, I mean, that's really, really much higher. You know, so like 35 to 45% of trips in, say, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, basically Western Europe, 35 to 45% of their trips on a daily basis within cities are by either walking or cycling. Even Canada roughly doubles our levels of walking and cycling. So you can't just say, oh, well, it's those Europeans, you know, it's those weird, exotic people on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. If you're not willing to look at Canada, look at Europe, just go over across the border to Canada and just see what they're doing. At least, you know, it's not like the European level by any means. But even in Canada, same sort of a culture, same sort of environment, lots of land and so forth, and colder, by the way, than the United States, for most cities at any rate, and still much, much, much higher levels of walking and cycling. And I would like to point out that the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, the Swiss, the Austrians do not walk and cycle more because they're poorer. They don't cycle and walk more because they can't afford cars. Those countries have standards of living that are every bit as high, if not higher, than the standard of living right here in the United States. Whether you want to measure it by per capita income, and especially if you use the current low dollar exchange rate, it's like, I think, 2 to 1 or something to the pound. At any rate, clearly, I mean, they are walking and cycling not because they can't afford the car. They're walking and cycling because they have introduced an incredible, attractive set of policies and provisions for walking and cycling that make it feasible and safe and convenient to get around their cities by walking and cycling. If you want to just focus for a second, this is the most updated information. We just did this, my German doctoral student and I, like a month or so ago. And you can see here that if you just look at the bicycling, we have about 1%, I think it's actually 0.9% of all trips in the United States cities are by bike. And if you go up to the Netherlands, it's 27%, 18% for Denmark, and so forth. So the point is, we have a long way to go, folks. We're only at 1%, the same level as Australia and the UK. And again, you might ask the question, is it something about the English language? I don't know. It used to be, by the way, and when you look at the UK, it's 1%, and that's actually 1.4%, so it is higher than the United States, but when you round, it's roughly 1%. They've had something like an 80% decline in cycling levels over the past 20 or 30 years. Huge decline for reasons I'm not going to go into right now. But you can be proud, folks. You're in Portland. You are not in Atlanta, Georgia. You are not in New Orleans. You are not in Newark, New Jersey. We are here in Portland, thank goodness. And it turns out that Portland, as a city, not as a metropolitan area, but as a city, and I can't even remember the source we used, but it was 2005. I think it was the community, whatever that survey is called. At any rate, this is for work trips. But Portland has the highest bike share of any large U.S. city. So you're at about 3.5%. That's a long way from 27% in the Netherlands. But anyway, it's much, much higher than what do you have there, 0.1% in San Antonio. So there's a huge variation. But you could be proud that Portland is at the top there. In Oregon, it turns out, and this was in 2000 from the U.S. Census, I believe it is, that Oregon has the highest percentage of work trips by bike. So you're doing pretty good. I have to praise you for that. One of the points I'd like to make here also is that it's not, some people would say, well, the reason that the Europeans cycle and they walk so much is they just got shorter trips. They've got more compact cities and more mixed-use development, and that's true, actually. So part of that is true, but it turns out even when you control for trip length, that Europeans make a much, much higher percentage of their trips by walking and cycling, even for the very same trip distance. And here, this is like hot off the press because my German doctoral student is doing this for his dissertation. And you can see, controlling for trip distance, Germans make about 2 to 3 times the percentage of their trips by biking and walking. So it's not just the fact that American cities are so spread out. It's also the fact there's no sidewalks in many American suburbs. There's no bikeways. There's no bike lanes. There's no special traffic signals, and so forth and so on. Not so much the case here in Portland, but I just wanted to point this out. It's not just a matter of trip distances being longer in the United States. It's a matter of, even for the same trip distance, you're getting a much higher percentage of walking and cycling. Another point that I think is important to note here is that there's this complementarity of walking, cycling, and public transit, in particular walking and public transit. Just look at 90% of all transit trips in the United States start out with a walk trip. And it turns out that precisely those walk trips that are to transit are the longest of all the walk trips that people make. And so having a really good public transportation system encourages a lot of walking. Having a lousy or non-existent public transportation system means you've got a car and you end up making even your very shortest trips by car. Cycling, I think, is something that can start at a very young age, and it certainly does if you look at your most, say, German or Danish or Dutch cities. And I'm convinced, since I'm getting older myself, and I hope this is true, that as we get older we can continue to cycle because I think it's a really valuable form of exercise. It's a great form of independence and mobility. It actually helps us achieve all sorts of practical objectives, getting from point A to point B, for example. And you can do all sorts of things to encourage, to maintain cycling levels as you get older. This is probably my favorite slide in the entire presentation, so pay attention, folks. What this says is, even as we get older, we definitely, without any question, have the physical and mental ability to keep on cycling, to keep on walking. In the United States, what you see here, you can see the different age groups, but you see here that in the United States, all age groups sort of basically don't walk and don't cycle, but look at the highest here, 65 and older, we have 0.2. That's 0.2% of all trips by bicycling in the 65 and over category. In Germany and the Netherlands, and they have even older age categories from their census and so forth, 75 and older, get this, that the Germans and the Dutch who are 75 and older make over half of their trips by walking and cycling. And I think, for me, the most stunning part of this is look at the Dutch elderly. A fourth of all trips made by the Dutch elderly, 75 years of age or older, are by cycling. Can you imagine, if you ask the average American, do you think that people over 75 years of age could make a quarter of their trips by bike? They'd say, no way, physically impossible, can't do it. Well, I think this is a hopeful message because what it says, our populations are getting older and older and older. We have a very, very strong demographic trend toward aging. A higher and higher percentage of Americans and Canadians and Western Europeans and Australians are over 65, over 75, over 85. And I think this is awfully important because it says as we get older, we really can still walk and cycle. And these are extraordinarily valuable forms of physical activity. They make us healthier. They help us keep going. They give us socially integrate us with our friends and neighborhoods and societies and so forth. And we don't have to rely on our neighbors or our friends. Call them up every time you want to go somewhere. It gives you mobility, independence, and really, really valuable physical activity. And it might be why the Germans and the Dutch have longer life expectancies than Americans. I get carried away with this, so you have to forgive me, but Americans spend more than twice as much on health care expenditures as Western Europeans, and yet we don't live as long. Now, you just think about that. Aren't we doing something wrong? Spending more than twice as much per capita on health care, and yet we're not living as long. And maybe if we walked and cycled a little bit more, maybe that'd be better than taking, all the sorts of medication and so forth. Okay, you probably get the point here. I think you can tell sort of where I'm going here. Anyway, walking and cycling, I think, are really important, but you have to make them safe. If you look at various surveys, the number one obstacle to people cycling everywhere you ask people, why don't you bike? It's not safe. It's dangerous. This is true overall for the population, and it's especially considered to be the case for the young. And it's not just a matter of traffic safety. It's a matter of safety from criminals. You don't want your kids to be kidnapped on the way to school and so forth. But the whole issue of safety, I think, is absolutely crucial. And part of that means building really good, safe, convenient walking and cycling facilities, but there's a lot more that goes to it as well, as you'll just see. And I think one of the reasons that you have so much more walking and cycling in European cities is precisely because walking and cycling there are, in fact, so much safer. And that's exactly what this slide here is showing you. Just look at this. I've controlled here, we've standardized this. So it's how many cycling and walking fatalities and injuries per trip made, per, I guess it's 100 million trip made, and per 500,000 kilometers traveled. So we've standardized this on a per trip and per distance basis. And when you do this, what you find is that walking and cycling in the Netherlands are about 10 times safer as in the United States. And in Germany, it's maybe like 3 or 4 times safer as in the United States. And this, you can look at it either from a positive point of view or a negative point of view. The negative is, ooh, it's sort of dangerous here in the United States, isn't it? But the positive way to look at this is there's no question that you can make walking and cycling safe. There is no question whatsoever. It is possible, and there's all sorts of ways to do it. In addition to which, and I'll show you those ways after this slide, but in addition to which, it turns out there's this concept of safety in numbers. The more walking and cycling that you have, the safer they become. I have seen a number of studies. Peter Jacobson has done sort of the best work on this. He looked at lots of different countries, lots of different cities, and also the same countries and cities sort of over time. So both cross-section and time series data without a single exception. What he found was as walking and cycling levels increase, they become safer and safer and safer. As they become safer and safer, that encourages yet more walking and cycling and so forth. So here I am encouraging we ought to do everything we possibly can to promote more walking and cycling. And don't think, obviously you're going to think, well, he's encouraging us to walk and cycle more, and he's just shown us that it's so dangerous here in the United States. But you can't really look at it in that sort of a static way. It's a dynamic issue. And it means that as we do, if we do, I hope we do, succeed in increasing walking and cycling levels, it means we're going to make walking and cycling safer and safer and safer. It's just going to happen. And one of the reasons is that as more and more people walk and cycle, there's more and more demand for walking and cycling facilities. That's one issue. And for programs to train people, for example, to cycle effectively. But also, the higher the percentage of motorists who also at some other time walk or cycle, the more sensitive motorists become to the needs of cyclists and pedestrians. The reason that Dutch motorists don't run cyclists off the road in the Netherlands is because they also, much of the time, are also cycling. The reason in New Jersey, when you're cycling on the roadway, that New Jersey motorists, who are pretty homicidal anyway, try to aim at you to get you off the road, it's because they never, ever cycle. So it's one of the reasons that you have this safety in numbers sort of a situation. Okay, what are these measures? I'll go through this now for making walking and cycling safer and more convenient. Just the categories first, and then I'll go through each of these in some detail. Better cycling and walking facilities, that's sort of a no-brainer. But note, that is one of 7 policies. There are some people who think, oh, well, all you have to do is provide better sidewalks and just build bikeways and bike lanes, and that's it. No. That is one of 7 categories of measures that I see enforced in much of Europe, almost all of these European cities, that really combine to make walking and cycling so safe and almost irresistible. I just did a paper called Making Cycling Irresistible. Anyway, so better walking and cycling facilities, integration of walking and cycling with public transportation. I'll show you specific examples of this, but I think it's absolutely crucial because there are going to be trips that are simply too long to walk or to bike. And so you're going to want to be able to take public transportation for those longer segments of your journey and then to walk or bike for the shorter segments. Or, of course, for an intermediate length trip, you can just bike the whole distance. But it's really, really, I just can't emphasize too much sort of how important it is to integrate these 3 environmental modes of transportation. traffic calming, I think, is absolutely crucial because it turns almost every residential street then into a bicycling, walking, playing street. But I'll get into that later. Mixed-use zoning and improved urban design, absolutely crucial for reducing trip distances to make them more walkable, more bikeable. Restrictions on motor vehicle use, especially speed. Traffic education and safe routes to school. I'll get into that in a second. And also traffic regulations and enforcement, which I'm big on. Because I'm convinced, at least in New Jersey, police and the courts literally have the message. I mean, it is their opinion that it is a waste of their time to enforce laws, regulations, and so forth that are designed to protect pedestrians and cyclists. We're dealing with murders. I guess you don't have enough murders here in Portland, but in New Jersey we have plenty. And so the police and the courts have literally, they've told the police, the courts have, don't bother enforcing regulations that protect pedestrians and cyclists. We have bigger things to deal with, like homicides, so just sort of forget that. So the police just don't enforce them. Anyway, I'll get into that later. Okay, what do I mean by better cycling and walking facilities, bike paths, bike lanes that are connected, really integrated? That doesn't mean one lane over there, maybe one lane over here, a bike path over there with nothing to connect them. You have to have an integrated, truly connected system of bicycling facilities. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be separate bike paths or separate bike lanes. You can connect them with, for example, residential streets that are traffic calmed. So there's different kinds of places that you can cycle, but they need to somehow be connected so that you can get from point A to point B without having to ride on dangerous, extremely heavily traveled streets. Wide, well-lit sidewalks. I've already mentioned this. You'd think this would be an obvious thing, but if you go to many American suburbs, there's just no sidewalks whatsoever. My older brother and his family live in Keller, Texas, suburb of Fort Worth. No sidewalks, none. And you don't see anyone walking either. Well-lit crosswalks, I think, are important, and that are enforced. That would be nice. But I just don't trust motorists. I just don't. But I'd like to have raised crosswalks and that really, that are well lit, that are well signed and so forth, so that cars really will stop. I think it's also important. Auto-free zones are great, and you'll find almost every European city with these sorts of auto-free zones. I think it's also necessary to focus on making all streets more bikeable. Because, again, especially in the United States, I just don't think you're going to have enough money. Well, you have enough money. That's not really it. But it's political will to have a truly integrated system of completely separate cycling facilities. And so I think it's very important to make sure all your roads are designed so that you can, not all of them, but most of them, so that you can cycle on them safely and conveniently. Maybe it means extra wide curb lanes, fixing up your drain grates, fixing up potholes. There's lots of things you can do to roads so that even without a special bike lane or a bike path, it makes them feasible for cycling. And especially making sure that cyclists have the right to use those roads and that right is enforced by the police and the courts. Extensive bike parking, I'll show you lots of examples of this. Intersection modifications that we minimize anyway the traffic dangers, and advanced green lights for cyclists. And now the pictures, the fun starts. Oh, yeah. Okay. This is a city where I lived for 2.5 years in northern Germany, a city of Muenster, about 250,000 people. And you can see it's the downtown area. It's the main street of Muenster, and there's no cars. It's car-free. People cycling, people walking. There's really, really nice facilities, a very pleasant environment, shopping, whatever. There's lots of cafes. You don't see them there, but they are there. And by the way, you should be very much sort of like the city of Muenster because it has a climate that's almost identical to Portland's. It never really pours. It just sort of drizzles and sort of foggy and so forth. But it's a beautiful, beautiful town, sort of just like Portland. Another shot of that same street, but from the side. And by the way, as you'll see later, about a third or so of all trips in Muenster are by bike. So really, really nice cycling facilities. Some people will tell you, oh, well, bicycling's nice, and we sort of like the idea of bike lanes and bike paths, but we just don't have room for those things in our city. Well, they just take up so much space. Well, the woman who is in charge of bicycling policies, and has been for the last 3 decades, actually, Martina Gutler, herself arranged this experiment on that very street. This is the view from the church tower you saw on the previous slide. So just so you can see what that... Oh, I'm sorry, going the wrong direction here. That's that street, okay? And that's that church from which this photo is taken. So you have 3 different things. you see that's how much space, I think it's 55 people, I think she told me. That's how much space the cars take up. And that's just for riding on the street. It doesn't even include the parking space that they would take up. It's twice that when you can space taken up on the street and also for parking those cars. And then you can see the bus takes up almost no space at all. And the cyclists, who are on the right here, are also taking up very, very little space. So don't tell me you don't have enough room to provide facilities for cyclists. They take up a minute percentage of the room that cars take up. Auto-free zones, again, as I said before, very typical. They're just in almost every single European city. And it's not just one street here or one street there. It's usually a connected, integrated network of car-free streets, car-free plazas, car-free zones. It's really an area of the city. It's not just an isolated sort of street here or there, which is what we often have in the United States, because of car-free areas. In addition, in Germany and the Netherlands, they have these things called bicycling streets. Muenster now has, I believe it's 20 of these bicycling streets, and it's sort of weird. You might say, well, you know, how does this work? They tend to be sort of narrow streets, as you can see. To the right is Muenster, to the left is Nuremberg. There's sort of narrow streets where you can see the sign says Fahrradstrassen. The cars are allowed on it, but at the mercy of cyclists. You cannot toot your horn. You cannot force the cyclist to go faster. That the cyclist has absolute priority over the entire width of these streets. And it turns out, I think it's a very nice idea, and it's just increasing rapidly in many of these cities. One of the nicest things I liked here in Muenster was this bicycle expressway, which is like a connector. It's like a beltway, but it's for bicyclists instead of for cars. And in addition, another sort of a nice feature here is the complete separation of pedestrians and cyclists, because actually the cycling volumes on this facility are very high. I think it's like 15,000 bicyclists per, I'm not sure what it is, per something. But anyway, it's a very, very high volume of cycling. And so they really find it necessary to separate completely the pedestrians from the cyclists. But just to show you how they really think of the needs of pedestrians and cyclists, to the right-hand side is a soft surface for pedestrians to walk on, and to the left-hand side is a hard surface for pedestrians to walk on. So you have a choice. I mean, how many American cities think of this? I ask you. That is a really, really nice facility. You can also have things such as these contraflow lanes. In this case, the left is Toronto, right is Melbourne. But this also then, it gives bicyclists more flexibility, being able to go in both directions on what for cars is a one-way street. It's a very nice facility. And this, in fact, is there's a whole category of measures here in Germany, and not just in Germany, in the Netherlands and so forth. They're called falsche Einbahnstraßen. And since that doesn't tell you very much, falsche Einbahnstraßen means literally false one-way streets. And it's simply a street that's one way for cars, but where cyclists can go in any direction they want to. In addition to which, you'll often have turn restrictions for cars. But then that sign at the bottom says, it has a sign for the bicycle frei, which means the bicyclist can do anything she wants to do. So I really like that. Or to the lower left, it says, well, it's a dead end for cars, but cyclists, and again, could go right through. So it just increases, again, the connectivity of the cycling network. And you don't have to go to Europe. You go to Davis, California, admittedly not a really typical American city, but you can go to Davis and see we can do this even in the United States. That you can have lots of very attractive cycling facilities, have a very high level of cycling. I think it's something like 20% or so of all trips in Davis are by bike, and it really works. And that's my wonderful colleague here, Susan Handy, with her two daughters to the right. I like the idea of this sort of, as I say, peaceful coexistence of the three environmental modes. You have here the tram, or the light rail. You have the cyclists. You have the pedestrians. I lived in Freiburg for something like 4 months. And, I mean, I never, ever saw a problem with this. I didn't see trams running over pedestrians and cyclists. I didn't see cyclists running over pedestrians. It all seemed to work. I mean, it just worked. You put cars into that, and it's a disaster. But as long as you've got something like this, you've got the tram, the cyclist, the pedestrian, I think it's a great idea here. Then, the other point, lots of points I have to make. Many of you would say, oh, well, Europe was always like that. Europe was always very transit-oriented, cycling-oriented, lots of walking, and so you just can't compare Europe with the United States. You could never, it was just always like that. Not true. It turns out in the 1950s, 1960s, most Dutch, German, and Danish cities had sort of gone along the American path. It's, oh, well, you know, the United States is sort of this model country and so forth, and we're going to make our cities sort of adapted to the automobile as well. Huge parking lots, lots of streets, lots of cars, and so forth and so on. And then, sort of like in the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, all of these cities sort of almost simultaneously discovered it's a disaster. Cars kill cities, and they kill people too, but they kill cities, they kill the environment, and they just were destroying their historic inner cities. So Germany, just as one example, but I just finished a paper now on what's happened in Denmark and also in the Netherlands, and it's the same sort of a pattern in all of these cities. A complete turnaround in their urban transportation and land use policies in the 1970s to restrict car use, to improve cycling and walking facilities, to improve their transit systems, and to coordinate transit, walking, and cycling to make them altogether a much, much more effective alternative to the car. And you can see what happened here. These are dramatic changes, folks. Look at Munich. This is not some little village. It's not Davis, California. This is a city of something like 2 million people or so. They managed to more than double the percentage of cycling in the city of Munich, from 6% to 13%. They more than doubled it in Nuremberg. They doubled it in Cologne. Again, these are big cities. These are monumental modal split shifts, folks. I'm not sure how many of you have sort of done research in sort of travel behavior and so forth, but increasing a modal share from 6% to 13% is truly a huge accomplishment. And this is at exactly the period when you have big increases in per capita income in Germany. And so on the one hand, you have this huge economic boom taking place, and also an increase in car ownership, but actually a very, very slow increase in car use. And instead, people will have their cars for their trips to the countryside and so forth, but lots more walking, cycling, and transit use within the cities. I think it's a really, really important point. Bicycling facilities, about 1,000 kilometers of facilities in Berlin, Germany. I'm not going to go through all of this, but the important thing is they've got 1,000 kilometers of separate facilities. This city, about 3 million people or so. And then they have 72% of their streets traffic calmed, which means 72%, and that's 4,000 kilometers. So they have 1,000 kilometers of separate cycling facilities plus 4,000 kilometers of traffic calmed residential streets, which for all purposes are just as good as the separate cycling facilities because they're very, very low speeds. Lots of different things. There are just various examples. You can have bus, bike lanes, lots of those upper left there in the Netherlands and in Germany. And unlike in New Jersey, bus drivers are actually trained not to hit cyclists. In New Jersey, bus drivers have this attitude, and if they see a cyclist on the road, they sort of aim at them, try to squeeze them off, and let them know they don't really belong there. Well, in Germany, they actually train the drivers. It's specific training not to hit the cyclists in the bus bike lanes. The other thing on the right-hand side, this is from Berlin, and you can see you have one cyclist on the separate side path, and you have the other cyclist on the roadway. This is important. In Berlin, they have they show you which streets this is true, but for most of the streets, you have the choice as a cyclist. You are not forced to use that separate side path if you would rather ride on the road. There are some people who simply would rather ride on the road, and they should have the right to do that. There are other people who want a completely separate facility, even if that does mean a somewhat slower speed and maybe more indirect route. Give people the choice is the point there. Left is just a regular bike lane. To the right, just to show you that everyone really does cycle, if you look at to the lower right very carefully, there's a nun there. And let me tell you, in Muenster, everyone cycles. The bishop cycles, the nun cycle. The most wonderful thing I have ever seen, I think one of the most wonderful in my entire life, is I was on the promenade that you saw a picture of earlier, and I was sort of just happening to be looking. I was walking, actually. I looked in one direction. There was this group of, I think, like 10 or so Franciscan friars. And they were also happy and smiling. And then I saw them sort of all waving. What's this? They were on a bike. And then in the other direction was a group of like 15 or so Dominican nuns. And they had their sort of habits flying in the wind. And I thought, this is a picture of heaven for sure. I mean, you know that is an acceptable mode of transportation when you see such a thing. And again, this is from Odense, Denmark, I believe it is. It's Denmark for sure. It's Odense. And you can see everyone cycling there, and no Lycra. I don't think I see any Lycra there. You have one man wearing a helmet, but you know, this is just the way people are dressed every day. You might have also noticed in all of these pictures, almost no one's wearing a helmet. So that you have, in fact, in the Netherlands, 2 to 3% of all adults wear a helmet. In Germany, it's about 5%, and yet they have a fatality rate and an injury rate that's about a tenth or a fifth of what it is here in the United States. We'll talk about that later if anyone's interested in it. But anyway, just note this. Almost no one's wearing a helmet. Lots of different designs to these cycling facilities. To the upper left, you can see one of the problems of bicycle paths that are to the side is if a motorist is making a right-hand turn, you only see them, the cyclist, at the last second, and it's the cause of many accidents. What the Dutch do is they then make the path sort of veer out to the right and make also a very, very sharp right-hand turn for the motorist. So both the cyclist and the motorist have to slow down. They have more time and space to see each other, and it's tremendously increased the safety of bicycle paths where they're crossing intersections such as this. Lower left, you can see what they do is they take the bike path or lane around the transit stop so that passengers getting off a bus don't walk into the path of the cyclist and so forth. This is just giving you an example here of the connectivity. This is not a particularly cycling-oriented city, but Freiburg, Germany, well, it's not bad. It's like 20-some%. But it's not the top, that's for sure. Muenster is like the top. I think Freiburg has 20-25%. As you can see, they have a very connected network. It's not just a lane here, a path there. This is an extremely well-connected network. I was just talking to the bike planner. I was in Freiburg this summer, and he was very proud. He said this is what they consider their main sort of advantage. And one of the things that's the main sort of incentive to cycling is they really do have a completely integrated network. And they have 100% of their residential neighborhoods are traffic calmed on top of this. So it really makes it useful. Cut-throughs for cyclists. This one was in Melbourne. This was actually my favorite cut-through. This was right around the University of Sydney where I was 2 years ago. And it was both for pedestrians and for cyclists. One of the things that's another important point, and that is it's not just sort of the scenic, historic inner cities where Europeans have been more successful in promoting walking and cycling. It turns out this is the suburban area, new developments in Muenster, Germany, but it's also true for suburbs around Dutch cities and many, many, many German cities as well. And that is that by building code, they have zoning codes, building codes that specifically require that any time any new development is built, it must come equipped with bicycling and walking facilities. And you can see them right here. This is a brand new development here, way on the outskirts of Muenster. And yet by law, by zoning code, you must provide walking and cycling facilities. Nice to have these bicycling bridges and so forth, pedestrian bicycling bridges. This is in Brisbane. Also have a floating bikeway in Brisbane. But you've got one here in Portland, Oregon, which I hope to experience sometime soon during my visit, once I recuperated from the jet lag. Also, I'm in favor of always giving traffic priority to pedestrians and cyclists. I mean, and to trams as well. But at any rate, in New Jersey, I have never seen one single intersection where cyclists get priority. In this case, it's hard. I can't go through all these in great detail, but there's actually more traffic lights for the cyclists than there are for the motorists. If you're to the upper right, that's a traffic signal in Muenster. Lower left is in Amsterdam. And the nice thing is, it just shows you how they care about cyclists. You get a long distance signal and a short distance. So you have to the lower left, to the up top, you have the whole post is all cyclist sort of traffic lights. But what it is, if you're right at the intersection, you don't want the cyclist to have to look up like this and strain your neck. And so you have one set of bicycle signals at the bottom, a sort of eye level if you're right at the intersection, and another set for higher up. Anyway, all of these. Oh, I like the one in the bottom middle, too. This is a sign from Germany, and it says, watch out. Okay, the sign at the top is, watch out, caution, and then there's bicycles coming at you from every direction. Watch out. I sort of like that. The other thing I like, several Canadian cities have these sort of sensors in the roadway, and you simply have to put your bike over it and the light turns green for you. I think that's a pretty good feature as well. But this is maybe even neater. In Odense, Denmark, they do some really neat things. They actually synchronize all of their traffic lights for cyclist speeds. And this is not some tiny city. It's about 250,000 people in Odense. But not only do they synchronize the lights for cyclist speeds, if you look to the left there, you see these posts with these sort of bluish kinds of lights. They actually have a pulsating light that goes at the speed at which you should be cycling, so you will get the green light at every single intersection. And then, if you're curious how fast you're cycling, look to the lower right, and it tells you how fast you're cycling. And they have, in fact, it's just unbelievable. They have certain commuter routes with really long distances, and they have a higher synchronized speed for those routes than they have for the shorter inner city routes, because they know the commuter cyclists want to cover a longer distance fast. I'm thinking, I mean, how can you top that? Then you can see also they have to the upper right special sort of this blue, bright blue marking of the lanes. And the other thing you can do, this is in Muenster, you can very highly have bright red markings there for the bike lanes as they cross the intersections. Because again, one of the main causes of accidents or crashes, collisions, is you don't see the other person. And this just highlights for the motorist, watch out, there's going to be cyclists crossing here. And by the way, well, we'll get to this later. Okay. The other thing, this is also Odense, Denmark, lots and lots of these sort of right-hand shortcuts at intersections. So you don't have to go to the intersection at all. You take a right-hand turn, you just continue on your way making the right-hand turn, and then they have these so-called T intersections. So there's no reason why the cyclist should have to stop at the red light. He or she is not crossing any motor vehicle traffic there anyway, and so the sign under that red light simply says a cyclist can go ahead and proceed right ahead even when it's red. Now this is another one where this is in the most densely populated area in all of Germany. And note here you have 3 bike lanes, or 1 bike path and 2 bike lanes, and you have 2 lanes for cars. It's a matter of priorities. Don't tell me you don't have enough space for cycle facilities. It's a matter of priorities. And here in the most densely populated area of all of Germany, certainly no excess space, that's for sure. And yet they are setting a signal here. They're saying, we think cycling is more important than the car, and we're going to show that, and we're going to give them the facilities and the space. This is from Muenster again. This is actually just on the way to the student cafeteria where I used to eat. But you see a special lane here to the right. It sort of funnels the cyclists, first of all, to the very front of the intersection. Then the following thing happens. The bikes, and this is what the sign says, you can't read it, and neither can I because it's too small. But the sign there, just to the right of where that bike sign is, says cyclists should proceed to the front, to the advanced stop line. They should fill up the entire area in front of the cars, and then they get an advanced green light. I mean, what else can you ask for, folks? I mean, really. It is well thought out. It is faster then. So again, the cyclists are getting the advanced green light. It's faster. It's safer. It's much safer. You can see the cyclists are already halfway through the intersection, and the cars haven't even started. The cyclists are very visible to the motorists, so there's no chance they're going to accidentally hit them. And it's more convenient as well. I mean, I don't want to be a cyclist behind a car having to breathe the pollution. This way, they're in front of the cars for that reason as well. Traffic calming, I'm running out of time here, obviously, but I can't go into any great detail, but there's 2 kinds of traffic calming, and in fact, it's quite different in terms of Germany and the Netherlands. In many German cities, there's less in the way of actual physical infrastructure to traffic calm neighborhoods, whereas in Dutch cities, you see more of the sort of infrastructural changes. But anyway, the point is, it reduces by law the speed to be 30 kilometers or less, which would be, I guess that's 18 miles per hour or less. And then many cities, especially in the Netherlands and in Denmark as well, introduce specific infrastructure measures, which I really can't go into. I can tell you one thing, traffic calming is a lot more than just speed humps. Many, many things you can do to force cars to slow down. This is just an example. I took this picture in Amsterdam a few years ago. About 10 years ago, actually, in just a very pleasant traffic calm neighborhood. The extreme form of traffic calming, which of course I like the best, is the home zone, which means it has a maximum speed limit of 7 kilometers per hour. And in fact, if you look at the sign, this is the official sign for a home zone, as it were, or a Wohnort in Germany. In Germany, they're called Spielstraßen. And you can see you have a kid playing in the street, you have someone walking, and you even have a car there. But everyone is considered to have the same right to use that space, and cars cannot toot their horns and run over pedestrians and cyclists and so forth. Here we have the integration of, I am running out of time, I'm really sorry, but anyway, the integration of transit and cycling is absolutely crucial, absolutely. You should be able to take your bike on trains, on trams, that's the left is the tram, take it on buses and so forth, and to the lower right, the German rail system, we just figured out the number of such bikes they have, but it's something like now 20,000 bikes are provided in this kind by the German railway system, and you simply take your cell phone, dial a number, and then it unlocks the bike for you. Pretty good facility. Nice bike parking here to the left. Those are both the bike parking garage, or whatever you want to call it, in Muenster called Fahrradstrassen, which means bicycle station. It's immediately next to the main train station. It includes bike repairs, bike rentals, washing your bike. I wish I'd included that picture. They have a bike washing facility as well. This is that same facility from sort of up close, as it were. And you can see it's a really, really nice facility. 3,500 spaces. They have long-term, medium-term, long-term parking. And once you've parked your bike, you can immediately then go to the platform to get your train. You can't imagine better intermodal coordination. This is a case in Chicago, and the suburban train station is immediately below this. So again, it's a very nice coordination. You can do it in the United States as well. All different kinds of bike parking, simply next to bus stops. Nothing fancy, but anyway, certainly useful. This is another example. This is in, I believe it's in either the Netherlands. I'm not sure exactly. Either the Netherlands or Denmark. I'm not sure now. But anyway, just very practical. I mean, why can't we have such bike parking at every single bus stop? That would be nice. And one of the successes we've had in the United States is having racks, bike racks on buses. And we have over 50,000 actually buses in the United States now equipped with bike racks. More bike parking. Take the parking away from cars and give it to the cyclists, is my opinion. And you can see it to the left here. You have on-street parking, and they've simply taken. In fact, the woman, Martina, who was the head of their cycling policies there, really put this through. And she said, you know, we want to discourage car use, so she took many, many, many places away from car parking on streets and gave it to the bikes instead. You can do the same thing in the United States. This is exactly the same thing was done in San Francisco. In Toronto, they have a special design to their sort of bike, I guess they call post and ring bike stands, but they have a policy. Every single year, they install 1,000 of these post and ring bike stands. So they have actually the largest supply of bike parking in any North American city. Something that I think would be awfully convenient in Odense, again, this is in Denmark, they have these air pumps for cyclists all over the city, which I think is great. Cyclists on bikes are really great, and I took this shot to the lower right when I was living in Bondi. These policemen were so nice. I mean, I kept on this angle, that angle, smile, do this, and they were still smiling. They were so nice. But I think it's really important to have police on bikes. I think it sends a signal. Cycling is legitimate. Cyclists are legitimate. It's not like we're criminals just because we're on two wheels. And I think it's important to have bicyclists, police on bikes. And what about mail? This is to the lower left is Muenster, to the right is somewhere in Denmark. And again, just everything is done by bike there. Give employees bikes. I mean, this is in Odense, Denmark again. The firms give their employees free bikes. Well, to encourage the commute to work. It's the, as I say here, the perfect zero emissions vehicle. Why not? You know, the bike that you're giving your employee for free costs a heck of a lot less than the free parking space that they're currently giving their employees. I mean, instead of giving people free parking spaces, give them free bikes and let them commute by bike. That'd be a lot more sensible. Free internet bike planning, I really can't go into this at all, but in Berlin they actually have a specific sort of website. You tell where you are, where you want to go, but what's important is they realize people have different preferences. Some people have a preference for speed. Other people simply want to avoid car traffic as much as possible. Some people want the most direct route. Some people want to avoid traffic lights. Some people want to bicycle through parks. You can enter all of these preferences into this computer program, and then what comes out, and you can see it here in red on the map, is the preferred route. If your preferences are A, B, C, D, E, this is your route. And there's all sorts of icons you can click on. It'll tell you then the nearest subway station, the nearest suburban rail station, where is the bike parking. I mean, I consider that a really nice program. And then in Odense, you can also do it using your mobile phone. Traffic education, I think, is crucial. And I'm not sure what it's like here in Oregon, but it's a disgrace in New Jersey. Motorists haven't a clue, and couldn't care less, about how they should drive to avoid hitting pedestrians and cyclists. Crosswalks in New Jersey are absolutely, totally meaningless. And red lights for the first 2 or 3 seconds are also meaningless. And I think there needs to be a lot more emphasis on training motorists. Before they get that license, they should go through some pretty rigorous training to be sure they understand what the rights of pedestrians and cyclists are and how they should be driving to avoid hitting them in any sort of a collision. The other part of this, of course, is educating pedestrians and cyclists. And it turns out that in every German and Dutch city, kids already have extensive training in walking and cycling by the time they're in the 3rd or 4th grade, which I'll get to later. But this is actually part of the official German licensing test. My German doctoral student got these off the internet. And each of these pictures is associated with a multiple choice list. And it says, oh, what's the right thing? What are you supposed to do as a motorist? In every single case, the right answer is yield to the pedestrian, yield to the cyclist. And that may be obvious for the first 3. But to the lower right, there's a really interesting picture. And you might say, well, what in the world is that about? And I actually had to ask my German doctoral student, because he got this, and he said, well, it's the following. In Germany, and in Holland, and in Belgium, and in Denmark, if you hit, as a motorist, if you hit a child or elderly cyclist or pedestrian, you are in deep trouble. It is your fault no matter what. Because it is considered, and this is taught also in the driver education, it is considered it is your responsibility as a motorist to anticipate possibly dangerous situations where you have children or elderly pedestrians and cyclists doing unpredictable things or even illegal things. It is your fault. It doesn't matter whether that child or elderly person is somehow disobeying the regulation. It is your responsibility to avoid hitting that cyclist. And the point of this slide is, to the lower right, is that kid on that bike might, in any second, dart out into the road. If you hit that kid on the bike, it's your fault, it's not the kid's fault. And therefore, it really puts motorists on the defensive. It says, you are the evil mode of transportation, and the others aren't. And it's your responsibility to watch out and not to hit these kids and elderly. This is just an example of a sort of a test training course for cycling. It's in Berlin, actually. But all German and Dutch kids by the 3rd or 4th grade have to take these police-administered tests, I would emphasize, police-administered tests to make sure you can cycle effectively and safely. Safe Routes to Schools is like a big program here in the United States, which I can't really get into any details, but isn't it striking? Look at this. In 1974, 60% of kids in the United States either walked or biked to school, and now it's 13%. If that's not disgusting, folks, I don't know what is. I mean, and then we ask, why do we have a quadrupling in childhood obesity? My goodness, might it not have something to do with the fact that kids now get driven to school instead of walking or cycling, get virtually no exercise at all? I mean, there's diet, obviously, as well. What people eat and how much they eat makes a big difference, clearly. But the fact that they're just not getting any exercise whatsoever on this daily trip to school, I think, is really a problem. And part of that, if you're going to encourage more walking and cycling by kids and everybody else, you need to have good crosswalks. This is one actually where I was living in North Mondot. I'm almost finished. Mixed zoning and better urban design. Again, you can teach a whole course in this, so I'm not going to even go into it. But clearly, it's really important to have zoning codes and building codes that encourage mixed-use developments. And to have an urban design that encourages people to walk and encourages people to cycle. If you have a really, really ugly, boring environment or dangerous environment, people are not going to want to walk or cycle through it. They're certainly not going to want to walk through it. They're going to get through it by cars and sort of protect it for whatever, as much as possible. The more attractive you make your urban design, the more likely people are going to want to experience this as a pedestrian. And then also having mixed-use zoning encourages the shorter trip distances. Put residential near your commercial, near the school, near the churches. Whatever uses you're talking about, mix them up together a little bit so that it makes it more feasible to walk or bike to get to them. Traffic regulations and enforcement, I do think this is really crucial, and that the burden of proof should be on the motorist. It is the cyclist and the pedestrian. Those are the more vulnerable modes of transportation, and they're the most economically, socially, and economically sustainable. We should do everything we possibly can to encourage more walking and cycling, and I think that we need to really put the burden of proof in collisions on the motorists. And also, I don't trust motorists anyway, so put traffic cameras at the intersection and put them in jail when they hit the cyclist or pedestrian. Okay, what do you know? I'm at the last slide. I have a lot more I could say, but I'm going to cut it there. I do think, as you sort of get the point here, there's an incredible broad range of public health impacts of walking, transportation in general, and public health benefits of walking and cycling. The one obvious one is, okay, it's giving you this physical activity, this exercise, it's healthier for you, cuts down on medical costs and so forth. So from a public health point of view, it's really good in terms of physical activity that it provides you on a daily basis, regularly, as part of your lifestyle. But there's two other, really, probably even more than that, environmental impacts. So we're not creating any pollution. We're not contributing to global warming by walking and cycling. So from an environmental point of view, we're really doing a big favor to the rest of the world, society, whatever, by walking and cycling. And then the third is in terms of traffic safety. And that is a big, big impact. We're talking about roughly 42,000 Americans a year killed in traffic crashes, and over 2 million injured in some. I think it's 2.5 million, I think, are injured to some extent, and 200,000 of those injuries are permanently disabling injuries. So that is a big, big public health problem as well. And I think we really, and by the way, a fairly high percentage, it depends on what city you're talking about, something like 15%, I believe, of all the total traffic fatalities are pedestrians and cyclists hit by motorists. And so that's a public health problem as well. But the point is, there's so many public health benefits of promoting safe walking and cycling. And I think those very benefits could be the source of a lot of public support and political support for just those kinds of policies that are necessary to make walking and cycling safer, more convenient, a more practical way of getting around on an everyday basis. And I think what I'm going to do, I think that the last point will be, I think we really need to get that message across. I think a really vigorous public information campaign, almost like a marketing campaign, is necessary to convey to the general public and to politicians just how important walking and cycling are to having sustainable cities and a sustainable transportation network. And why don't I stop there, and then you could ask your questions.
Hold on. Before we start on the questions, I forgot to give the one rule on the questions, which is because we are webcasting, we like you, if there is a microphone in front of you on the desk, to try to use the microphone, keep the touch button so the red light is lit so the people watching on the web can hear your question. If there isn't a microphone nearby, if you can find one nearby, that would be great. And I will also remind us that we need to end at 1:30, so we have about 20 minutes, so try to keep your questions efficient. Thanks.
I wish someone else would ask, call on the people who want to ask the questions, because okay, go ahead.
Your prescriptions, they seem to place a fairly heavy emphasis on separated facilities, and I know that there were some examples that you brought up of, for instance, having the option of riding on the roadway or on the separate facility, and that seems like a fairly sensible thing to me. But are you familiar with John Forrester and his his critique of separate facilities with effective cycling and so on? I was just wondering how you respond to some of the sort of adverse effects that he points out that might be associated with such facilities.
Mm-hmm. He and I have had many battles. My point is people should have the choice. He thinks people should not have a choice. John Forrester, for those of you who don't mean, I'm all for cycling. I mean, I do 95% of my cycling on the roads because we don't have separate facilities where I live in New Jersey. And so I'm not at all against cycling on the roads. But there are many people who really want separate facilities. And it turns out that, in fact, I know a woman in Australia who's doing this right now, that women especially, and elderly and kids especially, want separate facilities. John Forrester says, not only should you shouldn't have any option at all, you should only be able to cycle on the street, and that's it. No lights, no parking, nothing whatsoever for cyclists in terms of separate facilities. And my response is, okay, fine. You look at those countries that have absolutely no separate facilities. What do you get? 1%, 0.5%, 2% of trips by bike. Then look at those countries that have a very high percentage of cycling. The Netherlands, Denmark, you name it. They have extensive systems of separate facilities. John Forrester also argues, separate facilities are intrinsically dangerous. They're much, much, much more dangerous than just having people cycle on the roads. Folks, if that's true, then why is the fatality rate per trip and per mile a tenth as high in the Netherlands as in the United States, where they have absolutely all separate facilities? So, again, I am really, as you just mentioned, I'll emphasize it shouldn't be exclusively, the focus on just separate facilities, but the notion that John Forrester has, that you should have no choice, and that even though the other thing is when you ask people in surveys, what will get you most to cycle? 95% of the answers are, we would like separate facilities. And so John Forrester's approach is, number one, extremely dictatorial and non-democratic. He says, we don't care what people want. We're going to get them what we think is right. And second, it's just totally illogical, because if you look at the countries with the absolute safest cycling rates and the highest cycling rates, they're the ones with separate facilities. So that's, I guess that's my answer to that. Back there. I hope so.
Northern Germany, Denmark, and Holland have nothing on us on climate, particularly in the winter. Could you comment on how these facilities are used when the weather isn't splendid?
They're used even when the weather isn't splendid. I mean, I think you Portlanders, is that what you call yourself? I think you Portlanders are pretty sort of thick-skinned too. But in Muenster has, I mean, again, I lived there for almost 3 years, and you almost never saw the sun. I mean, it's worse than Portland in that way. I mean, it was drizzling, raining, and it got cold in the winter, and people still cycled. The mail still was delivered, and so forth and so on. So you're absolutely right. The climate in these areas, it's not like, you're in Southern California or some, perfect, idyllic climate. It's actually, even in those, they do, by the way, when it does snow, I wish I'd include this. I have 3 or 4 slides on how they have special machines to clear the cycling facilities of snow. But they actually do this. They don't just let the snow build up. But, it raises an interesting point. It's like, well, it's not the case that the Dutch and the Germans and the Danes cycle because, they have perfect conditions. And likewise, it's not just because it's flat. It tends to be sort of a flatter topography there. But, I'm not sure if you noticed my slide in the beginning, but you have very high levels of cycling in Switzerland, in Austria. I mean, I'm not sure about you folks, but those are not flat countries. I mean, they are not flat. The Alps go up and down, and you do have some distances. And by the way, in the United States, one of the most active and vibrant sort of cycling cultures is, in all places, San Francisco and in Seattle, quite hilly places. So I don't think it's necessarily topography or climate. And also look at Canada. Canada is much colder than the United States. It has a bike share of work trips 3 times higher than in the United States. So I don't think it's, the fact that a climate has to be perfect or topography totally flat to encourage cycling. I'm not saying, having a flatter topography certainly encourages, makes it easier to cycle, no question about it, but it certainly is not something that is absolutely necessary. How about over there in that corner?
In your pictures, I didn't see too many people. I don't think I saw anybody with carrying panniers, or I didn't see any pictures with kids on the back of parents' bikes. So I'm wondering, are they? They're not bringing anything with them.
I'm surprised now that I didn't have it there, but there's a lot of people who have their kids on bikes, lots and lots. But it might be because a lot of the kids just ride the bikes themselves. I mean, not when they're babies, but although they start really young. But there's lots. In fact, I remember when I was living in Muenster, it was just a normal sort of a thing, and I had visitors from France the first time I was in Muenster, and it was, I guess, just not normal in France, but it's very normal in northern Germany and the Netherlands and in Denmark. And they even had a child seat in the front and a child seat in the back. And so, anyway, it is pretty common. What's happening? I'll just end that question.
I was thinking about the integration with transit. I see like a lot of people pull trailer bikes, which wouldn't fit on a bus, wouldn't fit on the rack of the bus. So I'm wondering, do they use a different style to move their kids around? Or
I must say, first of all, most of the buses, this is where I think the United States is in advance of Europe, there are very few bike racks on buses. Instead, you park the bike either at the station or at the bus stop, and then you ride on the bus. On the trains, on the rail vehicles, you can take the bike on. But usually on the buses, I've seen very, very little in the way of bikes on buses, those sorts of racks. So it's sort of a different way that they use to integrate the facilities. Let me see. Okay, over there.
You were going to comment on the lack of helmets
Yep.
in most of your images.
Want me to do that? Okay. By the way, I personally do wear a helmet because I don't trust motorists. And I'm in New Jersey, and as I say, New Jerseyans, I'm giving New Jersey a really bad rap here, but homicidal. I mean, you don't know the kind of things you have to put up with in New Jersey. But I personally think you should encourage helmet use, but not require it. I'm really against helmet use laws. Because I think there's actually a big, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, a big controversy discussion about this whole issue. And you might be surprised, but most public health folks now are of the opinion that laws that require helmet use discourage cycling to such an extent that whatever benefits arise from the helmet use laws are offset by the tremendous decline in cycling rates. Something that I must say really almost shocked me. I just finished up, I guess 2 or 3 months ago, detailed case studies of cycling in 6 cities, 2 in the Netherlands, 2 in Germany, 2 in Denmark. And the Dutch in particular, I was just shocked, I must honestly say, were vehemently against any sort of use of bike helmets. I mean, these are the official bike planners. I mean, you could sort of expect this among sort of the normal person on the street, but they said it was counterproductive. They said if you wear a helmet, it's going to, first of all, discourage people from cycling, and that's a bad thing from a public health point of view because people are getting less physical activity. But second, it said what they found in their studies is people wearing helmets tend to cycle in a more risky way, and 3, that people wearing helmets are viewed by motorists as being less vulnerable. And there was even a study, this is really interesting, at Oxford University. There was a guy who dressed himself up in various ways. There was a woman with long hair, short hair, with a helmet, without a helmet, and they actually had a device that somehow measured how close the cars came to this cyclist. And they found is when the cyclist was wearing a helmet, the cars came much, much closer. And when the cyclist was not wearing a helmet, stayed farther away. But the other thing was, if it was a woman, was sort of obviously one with long hair, they stayed farther away. If it was a man cycling, they came closer. So for whatever reason, I mean, I don't know how motorists think because I'm not one, but that when the motorists see the cyclist, if the cyclist seems less vulnerable, they come closer to the cyclist. But anyway, the point is, so far as I know, it is in these countries, at least in Germany and in Netherlands, they have a policy, but it's not a law. I mean, it's not required to encourage child use of helmets. And that has, in fact, increased over the past 5 or 10 years, but it's still less than half. And I can't remember the exact, we actually did it by age group, and all these experts were telling us that for adults, it's about 2 to 3% wearing helmets. For the group of the really young, like up until maybe, I don't know, 12 years old, it was maybe 50%, 60%, and then it doesn't take very long, and it drops off to almost 0 again. How about you?
Going back to your plus 60 demographic and the compression of morbidity that you were kind of hitting at and the reduced healthcare costs, what sort of infrastructure is available to encourage people in that age bracket to actually go out and start doing that sort of activity? And are there any areas that are focusing on that in the U.S. or in Europe right now?
Well, they actually have special programs. In the Netherlands, I know this for a fact, to encourage, there's for those immigrants who are coming to the Netherlands who don't have a culture of cycling, they have special programs to encourage these people, training programs to make them familiar with cycling, feel them safe cycling, and so forth, including elderly people in those groups. But I would say for most of the Dutch elderly or the Danish elderly or the German elderly, they sort of grew up with a certain amount of cycling culture. It's not as if they didn't know how to cycle. And so what they try to do is keep people cycling. As I mentioned before, they have sort of these special tours for the cyclists. But it's even more than that. It's just the way these seniors are getting to places they want to get to. It's often by bike. And then for them, I find myself I feel more comfortable also often on separate facilities, just providing these separate facilities. And also the law. Again, what's also going to make these seniors feel more comfortable cycling, knowing that if the motorist hits them, they'll go to jail. And in New Jersey and in New York, there was a study. It's a little bit about digression, but I think it's sort of important because it makes a point. And that is, there was a study done of pedestrian cyclist fatalities over a period of 3 years in the greater New York metropolitan area. There were over 1,000, by the way, 1,000 pedestrian cycling fatalities over a 3-year period. And they sort of divided up the cause. One was, well, a third of these, no question whatsoever, it was sort of the fault of the pedestrian or cyclist doing something obviously illegal. And then another third was 100% the fault of the motorist, went through a red light, went through a stop sign. And there was sort of another third was sort of shared responsibility. Now get this, even though a third of those 1,000 pedestrian bicyclist fatalities were unquestionably 100% the fault of the motorist, can you imagine this? In only 1%, maybe not even 2%, either 1 or 2% of all of those cases was there any sanction of any kind whatsoever against the motorist. And they were not talking about injuries. These are fatalities. And when you have a legal system that works like that, it gives motorists carte blanche to just, drive as unsafely as they want to. And in comparison, you go to the Netherlands or Germany or Denmark, you hit a senior cyclist, you're in big trouble. So the senior citizen, even on the road, even if it's not a separate facility, on the road, is knowing, the motorists are going to cycle with some respect and consideration and avoid hitting them. I guess you were trying to ask something. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm just kind of curious. The argument you hear a lot of times in Portland, especially, I've heard it a lot, is people in cars pay taxes to be on the roads, and cyclists don't. And I'm kind of curious if you could kind of comment on if that, or if you've done any studies as far as how much money the cyclists bring into the facilities versus motorists, things like that.
Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of any specific estimates for how much sort of economic stimulation cyclists cause, but I would argue that motorists pay only a tiny percentage of the full costs of using a car. They're not really paying for the cost of pollution. They're not paying for the noise. They're not paying for the water pollution. They're not paying for the consequences of global warming. I mean, there's many, and they're not paying for parking. It turns out here in the United States, Don Shoup, who is sort of the guru of parking sort of analysis here in the United States at UCLA, 95% of all parking is free of charge here in the United States. And that subsidy is something like, he said, it's equivalent to like $300 billion a year. So I guess I'm sort of answering your question, but not quite the way you want it. And that is that I think that car use is tremendously subsidized here in the United States. It's not the case that car drivers are paying all these taxes. They're paying taxes, but those taxes cover only a fraction, really. Not even of the direct costs of the sort of the roadway network. You can go to official statistics. Turns out at the local level, in fact, most of the costs of the roadway network at the local level are financed through property taxes, and the cyclists are paying those as well. But I would argue a more important issue is that the car driver is not paying the full cost of parking, not paying the full environmental cost of car use, and all these other aspects, and congestion as well. And destroying our cities, I mean, that to me, they're not paying nearly as much as they should. And by the way, I wish I'd included this now. Doggone it, I knew I fleshed something out. But that is, clearly one of the reasons that you walk and bike more in these European cities is the cost of car use is much more. And so if you look at the cost of gasoline, for example, because I was just in Ireland a week ago exactly, and the cost of they call it in German benzene, and the cost of petrol or gasoline is like 3 to 4 times higher there than it is here. And guess what? All of the difference in the price is due to differences in taxes. That is, they deliberately put very, very, very high taxes on gasoline to discourage car use. They put very high taxes and prices on parking to discourage car use. They restrict car use in central areas. They have very high taxes when you buy a new car. So in Denmark, get this, folks, I really like this policy a lot. No wonder people cycle there. They have 186% sales tax when you buy a new car. I repeat, 186% sales tax. That means, I read this first in the official statistics. I said, that must be a misprint. Can't be true. It must be a misprint. And I called up the Ministry of Transport there in Copenhagen. Oh, no, that's true. We're very proud of this in Denmark. In Denmark, you pay for 3 cars, but you only get 1. I mean, if you had to pay, that's really a tax of 186%. I mean, that's really a deterrent to buying a car. And then on top of that, you're paying a gasoline price that's, whatever it is, I think we calculate it as $8 or $9 a gallon. I mean, no wonder. I mean, isn't that a really important incentive then to walk and to cycle and to take transit as well? I never give you a short answer, do I? Yeah.
I heard on an NPR talk show an environmental scientist asserted a rather inconvenient truth that he said, because of industrialization of agriculture and the reliance on non-local agriculture in the United States, the carbon footprint of, say, walking to the corner store to do your errands to offset the increased calorie consumption created by that is actually higher than if you were to drive to the corner store. Are you familiar with this assertion?
No, but it sounds pretty stupid to me. Because of the following. I would argue that walking to the corner store or cycling to the corner store is so much healthier for you. Why don't you do a calculation of all the gazillions of dollars that are spent on health care because people don't walk and cycle? And so that's my response to that. At the back, I think all those people... Go ahead. Yeah.
It was just in response to what you were saying about the higher taxes in Europe. And people in the United States are notoriously adverse to high taxation, especially as compared to West and especially North Europeans. So how do you think that could be applied here? Can we get high gas taxes or high taxes on cars? And secondly, Denmark's a pretty small place. It seems to me you could just go to Germany and buy a car over there.
Well, you could, but it doesn't work out quite that way because there are border controls, but you have to register the car, and when you try to register the car, that's when they catch you. I mean, otherwise, no Danish person in his or her right mind would buy a car in Denmark. They would all buy their cars in Germany and just bring them back to Denmark. That's for the second point. The first point in terms of the taxation, and I think it gives me a chance to make another point for me important, and that is you really have to be very clever at marketing this and providing a package of policies. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with congestion pricing in London. It's been very successful. The way it was introduced, the only way they were politically able to implement this and to get it passed was they put together the policies. They said, we are going to introduce this. I think it's equivalent to $12 a day. I think it's £8, or it's even more than. It's £8, that'd be $16 a day charge per day to get into the central zoning charge in London. But one of the ways they got it put in is that we are going to dedicate every single penny of those revenues to improving public transportation. And so I guess my point is, and they also said that we're going to improve cycling facilities, we're going to improve bike parking, this, that, and the other. And so the way they got it introduced was cleverly packaging the policies as a group. Sure, we're going to increase taxes, but we guarantee you we're going to make auto use more expensive, less convenient, and so forth. But at the same time, we're going to give you much better and cheaper alternatives. We're going to really make cycling faster and more convenient and safer. We're going to vastly improve public transportation. We're going to coordinate public transportation with walking and cycling. And it's that sort of a package of policy, which I think is really, really important. If you're going to, being politically savvy, I think one of the reasons that sort of the sustainable transportation community hasn't been as successful as we want to be, I don't think we've been clever enough at packaging our message to the public and to politicians and to show that it is in everyone's interest. For example, how do you get the vast majority of Americans to support policies to promote walking and cycling? Why not tell them? You know, you walk, for every hour you walk, you're going to live more than an hour longer, healthier. I mean, that is, I think Americans, for better or worse, it's sort of a human trait, I think, are basically selfish. And so I don't think that you're going to get most Americans to walk or to cycle or take transit to save the world, to save the environment, to prevent global warming. But if you tell them, walk or die, I mean, that is a message that maybe gets home. That it's not just a matter of saving the rest of society, but if you want to save your life, and you want to be healthy and live longer and save money also on health care costs, walk or cycle. And I think, I'm not saying that should mainly be the main focus, but package it in a number of different ways so that all of these incentives work in the same direction, because you've got to get the support of a majority of the general public and politicians, or it's just not going to get implemented.
And that, I'm going to have to bring it to an end, and I have to say, I wonder what your talk would be like with a full night's sleep. But anyway, I want to thank OTREC again for sponsoring your visit here, and thank all of you for coming out.
Thank you. I got to ask one question. Can people guess where this is on the last slide? Very good.
It's a lot of Bay Area trams.
The indomitable cyclist here, weaving the way. Okay. Okay.
Great.
Oh, thank you so much. Let's see, where am I?